mean, what I will say is that I do believe that where we are headed is kind of where we were headed in 1968 as we were getting into the summer, which, if anyone remembers that, which we don't because we weren't alive, but, from our readings and research, is that it was the most volatile time in this country. And I think that, we are at a tinderbox moment because, look, there are so many hot button issues that surround this larger issue of whose life matters, right? Whose life matters and what is quote unquote acceptable protest. I did a video earlier this week where I said, you know what? There is no acceptable protest for oppressors, right? Because Martin Luther King, right, took from Gandhi's book, let us do nonviolent protest. And he was beaten, jailed, and then assassinated, right? So if you sit in, they beat the shit out of you. You said that you want to, do freedom rides as they did in the 1960s in the summer. They burned the bus. You want to go, Black children want to go to school. They burn the schools down. And so if you march, they, created a rule in Florida by DeSantis that vehicular homicide is all fair game for those that decide that they want to shut down, the streets and shut down bridges in order to draw attention to the issues that are most affecting people in this country, whether that is abortion, whether that is LGBTQ rights, whether that is climate change, or whether right now we're asking ourselves where our tax dollars are going, right? Which is something that, prior to October 7th, the majority of Americans didn't give a fuck about. To be honest, our money has always been going to Israel, $3 to $4 billion a year. But it wasn't until people started to recognize, wait a minute, they didn't know that there was an apartheid system that was happening there, right? A majority of Americans pay attention to what's happening on their block. They don't pay attention to what is happening, thousands of miles away. And so I think that, Jonathan, to your point and question, the point of university, right, is to be a lab of our greater society where we can have complex conversations and test things out, but and develop and strengthen our critical thinking. The point of what the right is doing in this country is to eviscerate critical thinking, right? Is to ban books, is to ban speech, is to weaponize language, right? And so I think that using this moment on college campuses is feeding into, their narrative, but I'm also not going to tell young people to stop, protesting and stop speaking out because of who's going to take over their movement, because they did it to the fucking Black Panthers. They did it to Black Lives Matter. They do it all the time because that's what they do.
Danielle, can I add something? I don't think people also are realizing that some of these liberals who are trying to crush these students are playing into the hands of the right wing, who are pals with white supremacists. So going back to who's really winning in this, I've been trying to warn folks that white supremacists and white nationalist leaders for the past 7 months have openly told people, I'm talking about their followers, that this is a divide and conquer moment to exploit Gaza, right? So you have Nick Fuentes, the leading white nationalist and anti-Semite who dined with Donald Trump. If you don't follow him, folks, you would think this guy is a very eloquent pro-Palestinian activist. Even people like Jackson Hinkle. Now, what we saw a couple of days ago in New York is you saw a white Christian nationalist, Sean Fuchs, who the day before openly said he wants more anti-Semitism because he wants Jews for the second coming, lead a pro-Israel march. Then you're seeing people like Elise Stefanik, who cares so much about anti-Semitism that she promotes the replacement theory and refuses to condemn Trump's anti-Semitism, use this as a cudgel to weaken and destroy public education, which Republicans have tried to do ever since Brown versus Board of Education, right? So it seems to me, Jonathan, that this moment, unfortunately, is being exploited by the right wing, especially Republicans who are perfectly fine with anti-Semitism. And establishment isn't calling them out. And it takes me back to a comment you made a couple of weeks ago. I think we should tell people. Danielle wasn't there, where Jonathan and I were the two nerds invited to a fancy Hollywood gathering where we were in backstage with Jane Fonda and Kesha. I can't believe I just said that out loud. And it's me and Jonathan looking at each other like, what the F are we doing here? And there was like Kerry Washington. It was wild. But Jonathan was on a really good panel.
They've been saying that they got to hang out with us. That's all they
talk
about.
No one said that. This is just Jonathan's delusion. But Jonathan represented all whites, and he did a very admirable job on a panel about like how to move forward with diversity and race. And he did good. He did good. Whites listening, he did you well. But afterwards, backstage, you said something to me in this moment. You're like, I don't think people are realizing that these white folks are playing for all the marbles. This is their moment. They're going to use violence. You said that to me, and it stuck with me. With all that's been happening right now, especially in this current moment, can you connect the dots, because you've done the research?
I'm going to say something like really personal, and I apologize in advance because like we're talking to lots of people right now. But it's funny, but my identity is being on the same side as you guys, right? Now, we're all on the same team, and we're all on the same team against the stuff I write about in Dying of Whiteness. And, I've written about racism in medicine, about how what I learned in Dying of Whiteness and what I was mentioning when we spoke back there between martinis and appetizers was about how white America was willing to die for supremacy in a certain kind of way, which is the argument of Dying of Whiteness. And I still deeply, deeply, deeply feel like we are all on the same side against the, we're deeply connected in many ways, personal ways, historical ways. I think people who come to this country and have some kind of historical trauma in their past understand what it means, this country in a different way. But Danielle and I, when we speak, sometimes I bring up this question of a polarizing crisis, which is this idea where people are on the same side, and then something happens and they are inextricably all of a sudden on a different team. It splits up people. And so I know this because I interviewed families where all of a sudden one guy heard Trump and Uncle Charlie was gone for good. He was a Trump supporter and they could never get him back. The pandemic, some people rushed to buy masks and other people thought the whole thing was a big government hoax, and they never came back. In a way, what a polarizing crisis is an existential threat. It's not like a random threat. It's an existential threat that people experience, and all of a sudden they divide into teams that are different than the teams that they thought they were on, and it's divisive. Now, why is that important now? Number one is because there are possibilities that, like, I have points of disagreement with people on my own team about this issue. It's come up in ways that are very personal because I want to be on my team and I believe in my team. And also, like the colonizer narrative, for example, about Israel, for me, I find to be really, really hard to swallow. Because I find it historically inaccurate, and because I've lived in Israel and I know the history of a lot of people I lived with who are not white and European. And so partially it's about that, and partially it's about I want to go with everybody. But I was interviewed after October 7th, 2 days after the October 7th by Washington Post, and the reporter who I know started to try to convince me that rape was an acceptable form of liberation in a way. And I'm like, yeah, I'm on your team, except not that. And I'm a guy who's been protesting Netanyahu in person for a long time. And so in a way, I think there are ways in which there are just these trigger points for us. And I think it's important to talk about them, identify them, expose them within our own narrative. Even if it means that we are having tension in our own position, because I just think that it's not so much that we are not as unified as we thought, even if we come to this issue again, I've spent a lot of time working for Physicians for Human Rights with people who really are against the occupation, who believe in Palestinian statehood, who believe in coexistence. I feel like there's enough room in all these positions to coexist. But I also think that the role of outside actors, Nick Fuentes is easy, right? He's a douchebag. But what's harder is the ways in which our coalition, the risks of our coalition fracturing right now. I'm just thinking of Jason Stanley's work, how the rise to fascism is brought about by a divided opposition. That's the lesson of Nazi Germany on down. And so I think talking about talking through, having difficult conversations among ourselves about things we might not agree on ourselves, those things can't be fatal. I just feel like we have to be on the same side. And Waj, I realize that was a long way of not totally answering your question, but in a way, I guess what I'm saying is I actually see the fracturing of the liberal coalition to me right now as big a risk as anything we're facing.